The sun hung high in the clear blue sky, making the massive glass front of Premier Autos shimmer like a block of pure diamond. Inside, the air was cool and carried a distinct, expensive scent, a mix of new car leather, high-gloss polish, and just a hint of freshly brewed coffee from the customer lounge. The cars on display weren't just vehicles. They were sculptures of metal and glass arranged under perfect spotlights like works of art in a museum. Red Porsches gleamed, black Bentleys stood like silent sentinels, and silver Mercedes models looked as if they were carved from moonlight. This was a world of wealth, a showroom designed for a specific kind of buyer, and the salespeople who worked there were like sharks in a very well-tailored aquarium. They moved with a certain slick confidence, their eyes constantly scanning, sizing up every person who walked through the automatic doors, calculating potential commissions with a glance at a watch or a handbag. Among these sharks was the top performer, a man who had perfected the art of the sale. His suit was impeccably tailored, his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his smile could be turned on or off like a switch. He had an instinct for it, a radar in his head that pinged loudly for a well-dressed couple or a person exuding the quiet air of money, and stayed silent for anyone else. He was in the middle of a masterful performance, charming a husband and wife who were clearly torn between two luxury SUVs when the doors slid open with a soft whoosh. He glanced over, as he always did, and his radar gave a tiny, almost imperceptible blip before going completely silent. The man who had just entered did not belong. He was dressed in a plain, dark, colored t-shirt that looked soft from years of wear, a pair of simple jeans, and scuffed leather boots that had seen their share of rough roads. His hair was a little messy, and he carried no briefcase, no fancy watch, just a quiet, unassuming presence. The top salesman's eyes flicked back to his promising clients, the newcomer already forgotten, mentally filed away under waste of time. The newcomer didn't seem to notice the cold appraisal or the way he was instantly ignored. He walked slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes not on the price tags but on the cars themselves. He didn't head for the flashiest, most expensive models near the front. Instead, he meandered, his path a slow, thoughtful curve around the edges of the showroom. He paused by a sleek, low-slung sports car, not with longing, but with a kind of curious appreciation like an artist studying another's work. He then moved past the line of sedans, his gaze thoughtful. The top salesman, meanwhile, was closing in on his deal with the couple, using his smooth, practiced lines about residual value and driving experience, all while keeping one eye on the main entrance for his next big score. The man in the t-shirt was just part of the background scenery, a piece of movable furniture that would hopefully wander out on its own. After what felt like a long time, the man finally stopped. He had found his way to a quiet corner of the showroom, a space slightly out of the main spotlight where the less glamorous, more classic vehicles were kept. There, sitting on its own, was a vintage pickup truck. It was probably from the late 60s or early 70s, its paint a deep, dignified blue that had been lovingly restored. The chrome bumper shone, and the tires looked new, but it still had the honest, sturdy feel of a working vehicle. This was the car that had captured his full attention. He didn't touch it at first. He just stood there, looking at it from a few feet away, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. He walked around it once slowly, his eyes tracing the lines of the fenders, the curve of the hood. He crouched down slightly to look at the chassis, then stood back up, his appreciation for the machine clear and evident. He wasn't seeing a price tag. He was seeing a story, a piece of history, a beautiful piece of engineering. Minutes ticked by. The top salesman had finally sealed the deal with the couple, shaking hands and accepting their deposit with a triumphant smile. He felt that familiar, satisfying rush of a successful sale. As he turned to head back to his desk, he saw that the man in the t-shirt was still there, still standing by the old truck. A flicker of irritation crossed the salesman's face. Most of the just-looking crowd had the decency to wander out after 10 minutes. This one was lingering, taking up space, making the place look untidy. He had a stack of paperwork to do, calls to make, and he didn't have time for this. With a quiet sigh of annoyance, he decided to go over and get rid of him. He would use his most polite but dismissive tone, the one that made people feel unwelcome without him having to be rude. It was a skill he had perfected over years. He straightened his tie and put on his professional, customer service mask as he walked over. The man by the truck heard his footsteps and turned, his expression open and friendly, without a hint of the defensiveness the salesman expected. "Hi there," the man in the t-shirt said, his voice calm and quiet. "I was just admiring this truck." The salesman gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's a beautiful piece, isn't it? A real classic." He was already planning his exit line. Something about it being a very special vehicle for serious collectors only. But then the man asked a question that threw him off balance. "I was curious about the engine," he said, his eyes lighting up with genuine interest. "From the looks of the valve covers, I'm guessing it's the original V8. But I was wondering if they kept the carburetor setup or if it's been upgraded to a more modern electronic ignition." The salesman blinked. The question was specific, technical, and showed a level of knowledge that was completely at odds with the man's appearance. For a brief second, he was taken aback. But his prejudice was a powerful force, and it quickly reasserted itself. This man probably just watched a few car shows on television and thought he was an expert. The feeling of annoyance returned, stronger this time. He wasn't going to waste time discussing engine mechanics with a guy who probably couldn't even afford the down payment on a used bicycle. So he chose to ignore the question entirely. "Well, sir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this isn't just a vehicle you drive. It's an investment. A piece of history. It belongs in a private collection, not on a highway. We only show it to qualified, serious buyers." He looked the man up and down, his gaze making his judgment crystal clear. The man in the t-shirt just stood there for a moment, the friendly look on his face slowly fading, replaced by a look of quiet surprise and disappointment. He simply said, "Oh, I see. Well, it's a beautiful truck anyway." The salesman's friendly mask was now completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard impatience. He had decided this had gone on long enough. The friendly mask was now completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard impatience. He had decided this had gone on long enough. The man in the simple t-shirt wasn't just a waste of time anymore. He was a challenge, and in the polished, competitive world of premier autos, challenges were to be crushed immediately. The salesman felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. It wasn't just about the lost time. It was about the audacity of this man. A person who looked like he had just rolled out of bed had the nerve to ask technical questions as if he were an equal. It was an insult to the salesman's expertise, to the very air of exclusivity he worked so hard to maintain. He needed to put an end to this, and he needed to do it in a way that would make it crystal clear to everyone in the showroom who was in charge. He took a step closer, invading the man's personal space, and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, yet loud enough to be heard, whisper. "Look, let's be honest with each other," he began, his tone dripping with a venomous politeness. "This isn't a public park. You can't just come in here and touch the merchandise. This is a place of business for serious people with serious money." He gestured vaguely around the showroom, a sweep of his hand that was meant to encompass the gleaming cars and the wealthy clients. "That truck you're so interested in has a price tag with more zeros than you've probably seen in your entire life. It's not for dreamers." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. A couple who had been admiring a nearby convertible stopped talking and stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and discomfort. The man in the t-shirt didn't flinch. He didn't get angry or defensive. Instead, he just looked at the salesman with a kind of profound sadness in his eyes, as if he were looking at a child throwing a tantrum. He took a slow, steady breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a surprising weight. "That's a terrible way to treat another human being," he said simply. "I was just asking a question about a car." His calm response was like oil on the salesman's fire. It wasn't the reaction he wanted. He wanted the man to be angry, to cause a scene, to prove he was the low-class troublemaker the salesman had already decided he was. The man's quiet dignity was far more infuriating. The salesman's face tightened. His professional composure was cracking, revealing the raw, ugly arrogance underneath. He let out a short, sharp, humorless laugh. "Treat you? Buddy, I'm trying to save you the embarrassment. You walk in here looking like that, asking about a classic V8? What am I supposed to think? You're a tire kicker? You're a waste of my valuable time. You're probably just some guy who gets his kicks pretending he can afford a life he can't." He was raising his voice now, no longer caring who heard. The entire showroom had fallen silent. Every salesperson, every customer was watching the unfolding drama. The younger salesman who had been nervously polishing a car in the corner froze, a cloth in his hand. His eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The man in the t-shirt just shook his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice still level, but now with a hint of finality, like a judge delivering a verdict. He wasn't threatening him. It was more like a statement of fact, a quiet observation on the salesman's terrible character. This was the final straw for the salesman. The feeling of being judged by this person, was unbearable. His ego, bruised and inflamed, demanded action. He had to physically remove this problem. "All right, that's it," the salesman snarled, his voice now a loud bark that echoed off the glass walls. "I'm not asking you anymore. I'm telling you. Get out." He reached out and grabbed the man's upper arm, his grip firm and possessive. It wasn't a violent shove, but it was a clear, physical act of aggression, a declaration of power. "You're done here. You're trespassing now." The man stiffened at the unwanted contact, a flicker of surprise and disbelief crossing his face. He looked down at the hand on his arm, then back up at the salesman's furious face. He still didn't say a word. He simply allowed himself to be guided, his steps slow and deliberate. As the salesman began to march him toward the entrance, the scene was surreal. In a temple of luxury and success, a top salesman, with his face red with rage, was forcibly ejecting a quiet, unassuming customer while a room full of people watched in stunned silence. It was a public humiliation orchestrated by the salesman himself. He felt a twisted sense of triumph. He was showing everyone. He was protecting his territory. He pushed the man past the gleaming hoods of the sports cars, past the startled faces of the wealthy clients, his grip never loosening. "Don't think about coming back here," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "We don't want your kind in here." They reached the large glass doors. The salesman used his free hand to slam the release button, and the doors slid open with a soft whoosh, flooding the space with the bright, warm sunlight of the outside world. It was a stark contrast to the cold, artificial light of the showroom. He gave the man one final, hard shove, not enough to make him fall, but enough to make him stumble slightly. "And stay out," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet street outside. The man in the t-shirt caught his balance on the pavement. He stood there for a moment, blinking in the sudden brightness. He turned back and looked at the salesman, who was standing in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. There was no anger on the man's face, no fear, just that same quiet, profound sadness. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his hands back in his pockets, his posture unchanged, disappearing into the flow of people on the sidewalk. The salesman watched him go, a grim smile of satisfaction on his face. He had won. He had protected his world. But as he turned back to the silent, staring showroom, he found no looks of admiration, only awkward, uncomfortable glances and the unmistakable feeling that something had just been terribly, irreversibly broken. The sun felt warm on his face, a stark contrast to the cold, artificial chill of the showroom he had just been thrown out of. He stood on the pavement for a long moment, the city's sounds flowing around him like a river, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a bus passing by, the murmur of people on their way to somewhere else. He didn't look back at the gleaming glass facade or the furious man still standing in the doorway. He didn't feel anger, not really. It was more of a deep, settling sadness, a disappointment in the way people sometimes treat each other. He had seen it before, in many different forms, but it never failed to leave a quiet ache. With a soft sigh, he started to walk, his hands finding their way back into his pockets. His posture as relaxed and unassuming as it had been when he first arrived. He had only taken a few steps when something made him stop. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but more of a feeling. A wave of secondhand embarrassment and frustration coming from a nearby source. His eyes followed the feeling to a simple wooden bench situated a little way down from the dealership's entrance. A small patch of public green space meant for tired shoppers. Sitting there, hunched over with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, was a young man. He was wearing a slightly too big suit, the kind that looks crisp out of the packet but doesn't quite fit right. His shoulders were slumped, and even from a distance he radiated defeat. The man recognized him. He was the younger salesman from inside, the one who had been nervously polishing a car in the corner, his eyes wide as the drama unfolded. He had been a witness. For a moment the man considered just walking on. It wasn't his business. He had his own life, his own problems. But the image of the young man's slumped form, the weight of his despair so visible it was almost a physical thing, wouldn't let him go. He knew what it felt like to be that young, to be trying to find your way in a world that sometimes feels like it's designed to crush you. He changed his direction and walked slowly toward the bench, not wanting to startle him. He didn't have a plan, no grand speech in mind. He just felt a simple, human pull to offer a moment of connection. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful space of a few feet between them. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, looking out at the street, letting the young man get used to his presence. The city kept moving, but on that small bench, time seemed to slow down. After a minute or two, the young man slowly lifted his head, rubbing his face with his hands. He glanced over, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a wary confusion. He saw a man in a simple t-shirt, a guy who looked just as out of place here as he felt. He didn't see a movie star. He just saw another person. "Tough day?" the man in the t-shirt asked. His voice was calm and quiet, with no hint of pity or judgment. It was just a simple question, asked from one person to another. The young salesman let out a short, bitter laugh that was more like a choked sob. He looked away, back at the pristine, hateful dealership. "You could say that," he mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. You saw what happened in there, right?" The man just gave a small, slow nod. He didn't need to say more. "That's my boss," the young man continued, the words starting to pour out of him now, like water from a broken dam. "He's always like that. He treats everyone like they're dirt. He treats me like I'm dirt. I love cars, you know. I thought working here would be a dream, but it's a nightmare. It's all about money and looking down on people. I hate it." He spoke with a frantic energy, his hands gesturing as he unburdened himself to this complete stranger. He talked about the pressure to meet impossible sales targets, about the way his boss would mock him in front of clients, about how his passion for engines and design was being squeezed out of him, replaced by a cynical need to just make a buck. "I saw what he did to you," he said, turning to look at the man, his eyes pleading for understanding. "That was awful. I wanted to say something, but I was scared. I'm a coward." The man listened to it all without interrupting. He just watched the young man's face, saw the pain and frustration there, and offered the simple gift of his full attention. When the young man finally fell silent, his shoulders slumping again, this time from exhaustion rather than defeat, the man spoke. "You're not a coward," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're a young man in a tough spot, trying to survive. There's a difference." The young man looked at him, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "But I didn't do anything." "You're here now," the man replied. "You're feeling what's right. That's not nothing. That's everything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Don't let him take that from you. That passion you have for cars, that's a real thing. It's valuable. It's worth more than any commission he'll ever make. A job is just a job. But who you are, what you care about, that's yours. Don't ever let anyone make you ashamed of it." The young man stared at him, mesmerized. This was the most profound, simple advice anyone had ever given him. It wasn't about sales tactics or office politics. It was about holding on to his own soul in a place that was trying to steal it. I don't know how, he whispered. I feel like I'm drowning. We all feel that way sometimes, the man said with a small, understanding smile. The trick is to find something to hold on to. For you, it sounds like it's cars. Remember the first time you fell in love with a car? What it felt like? Hold on to that feeling. Let that be your anchor. The rest is just noise. He looked out at the street again, giving the young man space to absorb his words. Everyone starts somewhere. No one is born knowing how to do everything. The ones who make it are the ones who get knocked down, feel that disappointment, and then get back up. But they get back up as themselves, not as someone else wants them to be. They sat in silence for a few more minutes. The young man felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it felt lighter, more manageable. This stranger, this man who had been so horribly mistreated just minutes before, hadn't offered him revenge or a solution. He had offered him something far more powerful, perspective and a quiet, steady empathy. He had made him feel seen. Finally, the man in the t-shirt stood up. I should get going, he said. Thank you for the talk, he offered a small, genuine smile. Wait, the young salesman said, standing up too. I didn't even get your name. The man just shook his head slightly, a twinkle in his eye. It doesn't matter. I hope your day gets better. And with that he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the sidewalk just as mysteriously as he had arrived. The young salesman stood there by the bench, watching the space where the man had been. He didn't know who he was. He would never know. But he knew he would never forget him. He looked back at the dealership, at the gleaming cars and the cold glass walls. It still looked like a nightmare. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might just have the strength to wake up. He took a deep breath, the air feeling cleaner than it had just moments before, and a tiny spark of his old passion began to glow again, deep inside. The silence that fell over the showroom wasn't a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with unspoken words and secondhand embarrassment. The top salesman stood by the now closed glass doors, his chest still puffed out with a grim sense of victory. He had protected his territory. He had shown everyone who was boss. He looked around, expecting to see nods of approval, maybe even a few grateful glances from the other staff who were also tired of dealing with lookers. But he saw none of that. He saw averted eyes, people suddenly finding fascinating details on the floor, and a general atmosphere of discomfort that he was too arrogant to understand. He mistook their shock for respect. Another salesman, a man in his late 30s who had been with the dealership for years, stood frozen near a sleek black sedan. He had watched the entire ugly scene unfold from a distance. He'd seen his boss belittle people before, had been on the receiving end of his sharp tongue himself more than once. It was just part of the culture, the price of working in a high-pressure environment. But this was different. This was a public display of cruelty, a performance of power that left a bitter taste in his mouth. What made it worse was the quiet dignity of the man who had been thrown out. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply absorbed the abuse and then, in an unbelievable act of grace, had gone outside to comfort a younger colleague. The observer had seen it all through the large glass window. He saw the kindness, the quiet conversation on the bench. That was the image that burned in his mind, not the ejection, a cold resolve formed in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about the mistreated customer anymore. It was about the soul of the place where he worked. He pulled out his phone, his hands feeling surprisingly steady. He didn't start recording a video. Instead, he opened a new email and began to type, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. He wasn't writing a long, dramatic letter. He was just stating the facts as clearly and simply as he could. He described the man's appearance, his polite inquiry, the top salesman's immediate condescension, and the escalating verbal abuse. He detailed the physical ejection, making sure to mention the other customers who had witnessed it. Then he added the most important part. He described what happened outside, The act of kindness the ejected man had shown to the young salesman who was clearly having a bad day. He finished the email with a simple, powerful sentence. "I don't know who that man was, but he has more class in his little finger than our top performer has in his entire body. And we just threw him out." He hit send, but before he could second-guess himself. The recipient was the owner of the entire dealership chain. Meanwhile, the young salesman who had been sitting on the bench finally stood up. He took a deep breath, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. "Don't let him take that from you." He felt a small but significant shift inside him. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt all-consuming. He walked back toward the dealership, his steps a little firmer than before. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, but he knew he couldn't just go back to polishing cars and pretending he didn't see anything. He had to hold on to that feeling, that anchor the stranger had given him, back inside. The top salesman had retreated to his desk, smirking as he booted up his computer. He was already crafting the story he would tell his buddies later, a tale of how he dealt with a time-wasting bum. He was so lost in his own self-satisfaction that he didn't notice the buzz of activity starting to spread through the showroom. The observer's email had landed in the owner's inbox. The owner, an older man who had built the business from the ground up, was not in his office. He was at a charity golf tournament, his phone on silent. But his personal assistant, a sharp and efficient woman, saw the email come through. She knew the owner's philosophy: reputation is everything. She read the email, her eyes widening. She immediately forwarded it to the owner with the subject line, "Urgent, please, read now." A few minutes later, the owner, taking a break between holes, checked his phone. He saw the urgent message and opened it. As he read, his face went from relaxed to rigid. He read it a second time, then a third. The part about the customer's identity wasn't in the email, but the owner had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who it was. The description of a quiet, unassuming man with a deep knowledge of classic cars and a reputation for extreme kindness fit one person: a very famous and very valued client of the brand who was known to visit dealerships anonymously. The owner didn't hesitate. He excused himself from the tournament, his voice sharp as he told his assistant to get the car. He was on his way. Before the owner even left the golf course, the observer salesman decided to take one more step. He forwarded his original email to the internal staff group chat without any comment. He just let the facts speak for themselves. The effect was instantaneous. Phones buzzed all over the showroom. People read the words, then looked up at the top salesman, who was still obliviously typing at his desk. The atmosphere shifted from awkward discomfort to open hostility. The young salesman walked in just as the message was spreading. He read it on a colleague's screen and felt a surge of confirmation. He wasn't crazy. What he had witnessed was wrong, and now everyone knew it. 20 minutes later, the dealership's glass doors slid open again. This time, the man who walked in was not an unassuming customer. It was the owner, and he was radiating a cold fury that was 100 times more intimidating than the top salesman's pathetic rage. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't even glance at the million-dollar cars on display. His eyes locked onto his top salesman, who was just now looking up from his desk, a confused expression on his face. The owner walked straight up to him, his steps heavy and deliberate. The entire showroom fell silent, everyone watching the final act of the drama unfold. The owner stopped in front of the desk. He didn't shout. His voice was low and dangerously quiet. "Pack your things," he said, his words cutting through the silence like glass. "You're fired." The top salesman's face went pale. "What? What are you talking about?" "You just threw one of the most respected men in the world out of my dealership," the owner said, his voice rising slightly. "You humiliated him, you insulted him, and you put your hands on him. And for what? To feel like a big man for 5 minutes? Your career here is over. Get out now." The salesman opened his mouth to argue, to make excuses, but one look at the owner's face told him it was useless. He was ruined. He stood up, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, and slowly, shakily, began to gather the few personal items from his desk. The owner watched him for a moment, then turned to the rest of the staff. His eyes scanned the room until they found the young salesman who was still standing near the entrance. Looking stunned, the owner pointed a finger at him. "You," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come here." The young salesman nervously walked forward. "That man you were talking to outside?" the owner continued, his gaze intense. "The man your colleague here just threw out like garbage. He showed you more kindness and respect in 5 minutes than this entire dealership has shown some customers all year. That is the standard. That is what we are from now on. We are not in the business of selling cars. We are in the business of treating people with decency. Do you understand?" The young salesman, overwhelmed, could only nod. The owner looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person. "Let today be a lesson. Arrogance costs you everything. Humanity is priceless." The fired salesman walked out of the dealership, not with a bang, but with the quiet, shuffling walk of a defeated man. The door slid shut behind him, and it felt like a chapter had closed. The air inside the showroom was still thick with tension, but it was a different kind now. It was the heavy silence that follows a storm, a moment where everyone is just trying to process what they've just witnessed. The owner stood in the center of the floor, his presence commanding, his anger replaced by a look of deep disappointment. He looked at his team, not as employees, but as people who had been part of a toxic system, and he knew he had to fix it. His eyes found the young salesman who was still standing near the entrance, looking like a deer in headlights. He motioned for him to come closer. The young man walked forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He expected to be reprimanded or worse, to be told his job was also on the line for not speaking up. But the owner's expression was not angry. It was thoughtful, almost sad. "That man outside," the owner began, his voice low and calm, "the one who was thrown out. He's a very famous person. But that's not the point. The point is, he didn't have to say a word. His reputation speaks for itself. We, on the other hand, we have to build our reputation every single day with every single person who walks through that door. And today we failed. We failed spectacularly." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But you," he said, looking directly at the young salesman, "you didn't fail. You showed kindness. You showed humanity. That's more valuable than any sale you'll ever make." The owner then turned to the rest of the staff. "From this moment on, things are going to be different around here. The commission structure is changing. We're going to reward customer satisfaction, not just numbers. We're going to have mandatory training on empathy and respect. Anyone who can't treat every single person who walks in here, whether they're buying a car or just asking for directions, with the same level of dignity, will be looking for a new job. Are we clear?" A few hesitant nods rippled through the group. I said, "Are we clear?" The owner repeated, his voice firm. This time, the response was a unified, much more confident yes. Over the next few days, the story of what had happened began to spread. Not through a press release or a viral video, but through the old-fashioned way, people talking. The email that the observant salesman had sent to the internal group chat was the spark. It was forwarded by one employee to a friend who worked at another dealership. From there, it made its way to a local car enthusiast blog. The blog post didn't have a sensational headline. It was titled, "A Tale of Two Salesmen at a Luxury Auto Dealer." It detailed the entire event, the arrogance, the ejection, and most importantly, the quiet act of kindness on the bench. At first, the story was just a curious anecdote in the small world of car sales. But then someone on the blog commented, "Wait a minute. The description of the customer, the quiet demeanor, the knowledge of classic cars, the simple clothes. I think that was Keanu Reeves." Another person chimed in, "I saw him in that neighborhood a few weeks ago. He loves old trucks." The theory took off like wildfire. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a rude salesman anymore. It was about one of the most beloved and famously down-to-earth movie stars in the world being treated like garbage. That's when the media picked it up. But the narrative that emerged was not what anyone expected. The headlines weren't "Keanu Reeves insulted by car dealer." They were things like, Keanu Reeves's response to being humiliated is the classiest thing ever, and a car dealer threw Keanu Reeves out. But he couldn't throw out his kindness. The focus of the entire story shifted. The unbelievable part wasn't the insult. It was the grace. News outlets and social media users latched onto the image of a world-famous actor, having just been publicly shamed, taking the time to sit with a sad, young stranger and offer him words of encouragement. It was a powerful, human moment that resonated with millions of people. The dealership's owner was bombarded with calls from reporters. He didn't try to hide what happened. He confirmed the story, but he did it on his own terms. He gave an interview where he praised the character of the famous customer and condemned the actions of his former employee. He announced the changes he was making to the dealership's culture, framing it as a lesson learned from a very unlikely teacher. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People weren't boycotting the dealership. They were praising its owner for taking responsibility and for valuing decency over dollars. Sales actually went up. People came in not just to look at cars, but to meet the team that was part of this new, more humane way of doing business. The young salesman found himself at the center of it all. The owner promoted him, not just to a sales position, but to a role as a trainer responsible for teaching new hires the dealership's new philosophy. He often found himself standing in front of a group of new faces, telling the story of that day. He never used names. He just talked about the man in the simple shirt. "He taught me that your job doesn't define you," he would say, his voice filled with a conviction he never had before. "Your character does. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how expensive your suit is. What matters is how you treat the person in front of you, especially when you think no one is watching." As for the man who had been thrown out, he never said a word about it publicly. He never gave an interview. He never sought an apology. His story became a modern parable, told and retold, a testament to the idea that true power isn't about how loud you can shout or how important you can make yourself feel. It's about the quiet strength of kindness, the ripple effect of a single, selfless act. The event had changed the dealership, it had changed the young salesman's life. And it had reminded millions of people that, in a world that often rewards arrogance, the most unbelievable and powerful response is still, and always will be, simple human decency.